Okay, in this video, we're going to talk about inversions and all the great things inversions can do for you when you're playing chords on the piano or other instruments. In the last video, we talked about just finding triads, major and minor triads in different keys, and how you can string triads together to play all sorts of chord progressions. But today we're going to talk about the magic of inversions. I'll give you a brief little teaser, and then we'll get into the details. So, let's say we have a chord progression that goes from C to F and back to C. If we're just using root position triads, we move our whole hand up like this from C to F and then move the whole hand back. But when we engage the power of inversions, we can change the order of the notes on the chord and maybe play from C to F like this. C, F chord, back to C. Or play a C chord here. We'll get into these details in a second about how all this works. But let's say we have a longer progression like C, G, A, F. We could even keep our hand in almost the same spot. We can go C, G, A, F. And that is actually the same as going C, G, A, F and playing off root position chords. So without further ado, let's get into the details of what inversions are, how we find them, how we finger them, and how we combine them with other chords to make smooth voice leading. So what is an inversion? An inversion is simply taking the notes of a chord and changing the order in which they appear. So if we take our favorite triad, a C major triad, which is C, E, G, well, a C, E, G chord, a C chord, which is C, E, G, is still a C chord, even if we put the notes in a different order. If we take the E and put it down here, that's still a C chord. If we take the G and we put it way up here and put the C where I can't reach it, that is still a C chord. If I put the C way up on top and the G in the bottom and the E in the middle, that is still a C chord. Whenever you change a chord around so that a different note in the chord is on the bottom, we call that an inversion. So if I have a C chord but I put an E in the bottom, that is what a first inversion chord. And if I put the G in the bottom, that's a second inversion chord. Now the inversions that normally I start my students with when we're learning about inversions, we aren't doing two-hand voicings. We're not doing things that are really spread out in the piano. What we're doing is just taking this C, E, G, and we are now putting the C on top. We call that first inversion. And then when we put the G on the bottom and the E on top, we call that a second inversion. If we remember that the notes in a triad are root, 1, 2, 3, the third, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the fifth, root, third, fifth. Then when the root is on the bottom, it's called a root position triad. When the third's on the bottom, it's called a first inversion triad. And when the fifth is on the bottom, it's called a second inversion triad. Let's do the same thing for a different chord. How about an F chord? Here's an F chord, root position. Now I'm going to change the order of the notes. The notes are F, A, C. I'm going to respell it so A is on the bottom. That's A, C, F. There's our first inversion F chord. And then I'm going to move the A to the top so that now it's now spelled C, F, A. There's our second inversion F chord. Let's do it with a chord that has a black note in the middle, just for the sake of making sure we are clear about things. So let's take an D chord. D chord has an F sharp in the middle. So when I go to make a first inversion D chord, instead of D, F sharp, A, I have F sharp, A, D. My thumb is on that F sharp, so I'm way inside the black key area to play that one. And then when I play the second inversion, instead of F sharp, A, D, I'm going to have A, D, F sharp. Now I have to sort of keep the middle finger of my right hand in the black key area so I can get my fifth finger on that F sharp up here. And there's our D major triad and second inversion. So let me show you what happens to the intervals inside of a chord when we play inversions. So if we're looking at just our root position C chord, there is an interval of a third between the notes in the chord. So between C and E, there's a third, and between E and G, there's another third. So we have this pattern of note, skip a note, note, skip a note, note, as I like to say to my students, right? But when we go to make an inversion of that C chord, look what happens now. Now we have a third between the first two notes, but then we have an interval of a fourth. 1, 2, 3, 4 between the upper notes. So it doesn't have the sort of symmetry that a root position chord does. Instead, we have this a third on the bottom and a fourth on top. It's important to sort of see that and maybe even hear it, feel it in your hands. If I then invert that, again, now the third is on top and the fourth is on the bottom. You see that? So sometimes people, you'll be playing a piece of music, and our students will be playing something, and I'll say, hey, look at that chord. What chord is it? And they'll look at a chord like this, C, E, A. And they'll say, oh, it must be a C chord because C's in the bottom. But then I say, wait a minute, though. How do you know if it's a root position chord or an inversion? And I'll ask them to look at the chord and say, is it all thirds, or is there a fourth in the voicing? Oh, look, C, E, A, there's a fourth in there. See, there's a third between C and E, and there's a fourth between E and A. Sorry, my webcam is bouncing around so much here. I put it right above my head, and I'm hitting it every time I talk. I'll have to talk with my head to the side. Okay, so we have to, if we want to figure out what chord it is, if we don't already know, because, eventually you just know this stuff instinctively because you've played the chord so many times. But if you haven't memorized what this chord is by now, you'd have to rearrange these notes until they're in thirds. So let's see. If I put the A on top, oh, there's still a fourth, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. So let's try putting the A on the bottom. A, C, E. Oh, now we're in thirds. And now you would know that is a chord. And that's actually an A minor chord. Because that would be A major. Obviously, I'm going fast through all this, but this is something a teacher would work with you at your own pace to make sure you're sort of integrating the information in a way that works for you and giving you ways to practice it. So, root position chords, all thirds, inversions, a combination of a third and a fourth of triads, that is. Now, what happens to our fingering when we move from root position to fourths? Now, there are a lot of different fingering choices we might make in the context of playing a piece of music, because fingering is always context dependent. But in general, when we're playing root position chords, we're usually playing 1, 3, 5, thumb, middle, pinky on a root position chord. And if you're just practicing like memorizing and finding all your root position triads, then you'd probably always want to use that fingering of 1, 3, 5 through the whole process, right? But that fingering might not always be the same when we move to inversions. Let's see. Let's move to our first inversion of a C chord. If I use the 1, 3, 5 here, that's going to feel really stretchy between the C and the G. It's much more comfortable to use our second finger on the G. So in this first inversion chord, it's way more comfy to use 1, 2, 5 instead of 1, 3, 5. Now when we move to our second inversion chord, I can go back to 1, 3, 5 because 1, 2, 5 would also feel awkward here. Hopefully that makes sense. Part of that is because the big opening in the hand is between the thumb and the index finger, so we can get a big interval there. But it's harder to get a big interval between like the pinky and one of these fingers. So there's a big opening here, but the fourth is at the big opening. That's fine with 1 and 3. But when we go to this guy here, this stretch between 5 and 3 that's awkward. Okay. That's going to be the case for like even when we move to chords with black notes. So let's say we're taking an E flat triad. In root position, 1, 3, 5 works great. We go to first inversion, we're going to want to go to the second finger there. The third finger feels awkward. And when we go to the second inversion, we're going to go back to using a middle finger because this would feel a little kind of off balance, I think. Not that it could never work, but probably not preferable. Okay. So that's sort of all the starter information about triads. And who knows, maybe if you're working with a good teacher, you might just practice playing inversions of some major triads for a while before you were ready to use those in chord progressions. It kind of depends on where you and your teacher feel you're at in the learning process and what makes sense for a learning pathway for you. There's no sort of one road to integrating all this information. But let's take a look at some of the things we can do with triads pretty quickly once we're starting to get the idea. So let's go back to that first example of moving from C to F. If we're just going from a root position C chord to a root position F chord, we have, of course, C, E, G, and then F, A, C. But what if we wanted to use the magic power of inversions to minimize the movement our hand does? We can do this. Instead of going all the way up here to the F chord, we can say, look, there's a C in the F chord, and there's a C in the C chord. I'm going to keep that C and just move my top notes up to F and A. So now I'm playing the second inversion F chord. So the movement from C to F just looks like this. C, F, C. C, F, C. It's a second inversion chord, so I can keep the same fingering, just moving my third finger up and back. And of course, that is a sound that we hear a lot in music because it's a very popular sound. Let's say I want to go to G from here. I could jump all the way down here to a root position G chord, but look, there's a G in the G chord and there's a G in the C chord. Let's just keep that G and move these voices down to B and D, and now I have a G chord because G's chords are G, B, D. Now I'm playing G, B, D. So now moving from C to G is just a matter of keeping the top voice and moving the bottom voices down a step. And keep in mind what we just talked about with fingering. When we go from the C to this first inversion G chord, we're going to switch to our second finger on the D. So it's third finger, second finger. See that? Now here's a cadence that I learned when I was a kid. I learned this in all the keys, and I'm really glad I did, and I use it all the time in my playing, and I teach it to students all the time. We're just going to go C, F, C, G, C. C, F, C, G, C are the chords, and we try to keep our hand in one place by using inversions. Pretty cool, right? You can practice this in both hands, then maybe even take a simple piece of music and try to play it with inversions. Whatever piece of music might have just 3 chords like that. The next step for some people is to then do that in a different key, like maybe go to D, and then take the same piece of music or maybe this next step is actually to stay in C, but to go start in a different place. What if you went to the first inversion of a C chord? Where's the nearest F? Well, the nearest F chord is a root position F chord. See that? And we have to switch the middle finger, the inner fingers there. And then when we go to the G chord, it's right there. And then we go back to the C. Just like over here, from C to F, we keep the C in both chords. C, C, C. And we go to the G chord, we keep the G, G, G in both chords. When we go to the first inversion of C to start, we have C on the top, C, C, C. And this G here goes G, G, G. And we could then also start on the next inversion of C, the second inversion C. Keep the C in the middle and go C, C. C, 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 C. And keep that G in the bottom. G, G, G. See that? There is an alternative fingering. Sometimes for these chords I might use 1, 2, 4 here instead of 1, 3, 5. And that allows me to move like that. 2, 4, 5, 4 on the top there. So like I said, these fingerings aren't set in stone. There are alternate fingerings that sometimes can even be better depending on your hand size. Okay, so we've covered what inversion is, what the intervals are in the inversions, some of the fingering things you think about when you're moving between inversions, and some of the beginning of how you might combine inversions to make this smooth voice leading. But I didn't actually talk about what voice leading is as a concept, so let's just finish with that. There's this word we use a lot in music, voice leading. And it goes all the way back to the beginning of this type of harmonic practice, which arose from people writing choral music and observing the way good choral writing will have smooth movement between all the voices in an ensemble. So the voices aren't like leaping all the time or crossing over each other, but they have like smooth movement. So let's imagine that this C chord is three people singing. We have a soprano, an alto, and a tenor. If I do just root position chords, I have a lot of jumpy voice leading. The soprano is going G, C, G, and the alto is going E, A, E, and the tenor is going C, F, C, and actually each voice is jumping over where the previous voice was when I changed chords, and that's often considered really primitive movement of voices. Now, if I use our second inversion F chord instead, listen to this beautiful voice leading. The soprano goes G, A, G, and the alto goes E, F, E, and the tenor gets to do one note, C, C, C. When I go down from C to G, like that, as I was showing you, like the soprano goes G, 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 and the alto goes E, D, E, and the tenor goes C, B, C. And that's considered smooth voice leading. And oftentimes, smooth voice leading is something that we aspire to when we're playing chords. The better you get at knowing these inversions and knowing how one inversion leads smoothly to the next, the more you're able to sort of speak the language of chords and inversions and move freely between inversions as you play pieces of music. So regardless, and that allows you to actually play some. You could even like sort of make all sorts of interesting movements with just a simple chord progression. Let's say the chord progression is C, F, C, G, C, like in our cadence, right? With inversions, we can really do a lot of interesting stuff with that. Just by combining different inversions, you can even create sort of melodies as the voices move smoothly through the octaves. And as the chord progressions get more complicated, you have so many options. We can just and once you sort of have command of this vocabulary, you just have the power to really think creatively and let your fingers wander over the keys as you move from one chord to the next. So you have a lot of power. So how do you learn all this stuff? There's sort of like the learning process that is just understanding this concept in the abstract, and that's sort of what this video is about. But then there's a lot of work to be done to just like integrate this idea so it becomes automatic, something you can do without thinking. Right? So I'm doing it while I'm talking. It's not because I'm a great genius. It's just that I spent a lot of time playing these chords and learning how they work, practicing them until they became automatic, like riding a bicycle. The more you practice these inversions and get them in your muscle memory and get them in your ears so you kind of know what sounds you're making so before you make them, the more you can think freely at the piano. And a good teacher can help you work through that learning process and kind of find a learning pathway that's appropriate for you, your lifestyle, your learning profile, etc. I do teach lessons myself. You can go to my website, cooneymusic.com, and you can inquire about online lessons or in-person lessons. I'm happy to work with students at any level that they're at, helping them explore this exciting world of playing chords.